surprising the President of the United States and the U.S. military by launching airstrikes in Syria. It all started early this morning when a Russian three-star general barged into the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad and warned the United States to stay out of the way and clear the skies. Russia is claiming it is targeting ISIS, but the Pentagon is not buying that. The United States saying Russia may be targeting Syrian opposition fighters and not ISIS. Now, those Syrian opposition fighters are the ones trying to kick Syria's dictator Assad out of power.
Russia has outgamed us once again.
The Pentagon was caught off guard.
The United States and the coalition will continue our ongoing air operations as we have from the very beginning.
Today, we see Vladimir Putin attacking with his airplanes.
That approach is tantamount to pouring gasoline on the fire. It's doomed to failure.
He's bidding for dominance in the Middle East against the United States.
It is imperative to find a solution to this conflict and to avoid escalating it in any way.
He wants to wipe out all of the opposition to Assad except Islamic State.
You don't let the Russians tell us that we can't fly over Syria.
It is imperative for the president to push back on this.
We fly anywhere we want to, and you'd better stay out of the way. That's the message that should be sent to Vladimir Putin.
Former United States Ambassador to the United Nations John Bolton is live at the UN in New York City. Good evening, Ambassador. And how in the world does the United States get surprised when both President Putin and President Obama, both in New York City in the past few days, and the Foreign Minister of Russia and our Secretary of State John Kerry in Russia? How does our military suddenly get surprised?
Because the president wasn't paying attention and President Putin was lying. I mean, look, this is an enormous strategic setback for the United States, the events of the past 3 days, in an area of vital American national interest. This is like a fire bell in the night to our friends and adversaries alike all over the world, that power in the Middle East is passing from America's weak hands.
Ambassador, how is it that Foreign Minister Lavrov and Secretary of State John Kerry can sort of stand shoulder to shoulder and meet today when it certainly does appear from the Pentagon today, from our Secretary of Defense, is that Russia is targeting the Syrian opposition, which are the very people we are training, which means that they are, we're against them. They're there against us.
Well, Secretary Kerry made a devastating concession in his speech at the Security Council today, where he, in effect, legitimized Russian military participation in the region, bottom line. That's a mistake in and of itself. Beyond that, while he did say that it was supportive of Russia only if they were attacking ISIS positions, the Russians knew from the get-go that that's not what they were going to do. And I think they're simply playing on this American weakness. It's just devastating for the Secretary of State to stand there and listen to Lavrov say, well, we've got a few technical differences here that we'll have to work out. I tell you something, I've known Sergei Lavrov for 25 years. This was a moment of triumph for him today at the UN.
Why is Putin doing this, and now?
In the immortal words of Bill Clinton, because he can. Because he sees weakness on the part of the United States. He sees irresolution in the effort to stop ISIS. He strongly wants to get Assad boosted in power, to create an axis, which he has effectively done, of Iran, the satellite government in Baghdad, the Assad regime in Syria, and the Hezbollah terrorist in Lebanon. He wants to strengthen Russia's military position in the United States, which he's done. He sees no effective American pushback. We haven't seen the last of this.
Ambassador Bolton, thank you, sir. And earlier, Secretary of State John Kerry went on the record. Now, he's in New York City for the UN General Assembly. We spoke to Secretary Kerry just hours before Russia began their surprise airstrikes in Syria. Late yesterday, Secretary Kerry and I talked about Vladimir Putin and ISIS. Mr. Secretary, nice to see you, sir.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
All right, what are we going to do about Assad?
Well, we're going to work with our members of the coalition, the allies, who are all combined in order to fight ISIL, and now hopefully be able to get Russia to join in the effort to fight ISIL. but also to be part of a political track, because you have to do both at the same time in order to try to come to a political resolution with respect to the transition to a government of credibility and a government of capacity in Syria. My hope is, judging on the meeting that we had yesterday with President Putin, I believe there's an opportunity to be able to go down that political track, because President Putin accepted the idea of a dual-track effort, and he indicated a willingness to try to work through a political transition. Now, what that means for Assad is not yet finalized, not determined.
Do you have the sense that President Putin wants President Assad to go?
I think what he wants is a solution to the problem, and he understands that Assad is a major blockade to do that. Has he turned around and said, I'm going to kick him out? No, he hasn't said that yet. What he has said is he's prepared to have a political process, and the end result of that process is really up to the Syrian people. So there may be a way through that threading of a needle to come to an understanding about where we're heading. If Assad insists on staying there, Syria will be destroyed for the simple reason that the jihadis, the extremists attracted to the fight, will come in even greater numbers, and you will never be able to make peace until you resolve the question of what is happening with respect to the political track of Assad.
But is there any indication that President Assad even wants to leave or is willing to leave?
There are indications that he has said publicly, if the Syrian people don't want me, then I'm prepared to go. He has also...
Do you believe that? I mean, there's been a lot of indications. There's a civil war there.
I don't believe what he says one iota one way or the other, and I don't wait to hear what he says. What I do care about is what Russia and Iran and other countries are prepared to do in order to try to solve this problem.
But within hours of our interview in his hotel last night, breaking news, the real Russian plan becoming evident. The Russians launching their own airstrikes in Syria, the news surprising many people in the United States. And just hours ago, Secretary Kerry addressing the UN Security Council.
My colleagues, the government of Russia has argued that we must support Assad in order to defeat ISIL. But the reality is that Assad has rarely chosen himself to fight ISIL.
And while going on the record yesterday, Secretary Kerry saying such an alliance will create problems in the fight against ISIS.
Putin now has put himself in the center of a problem. He's there. He's on the ground now. He says he's going to be there to fight ISIL. Well, guess what? If he's there to fight ISIL and he doesn't have the support of Sunni, he's never going to succeed in that fight. So he may wind up in a very serious situation. The only problem is it also means that Syria goes downhill. So we all have a responsibility because of the numbers of refugees that are leaving the country, flooding Europe, changing the politics of Europe, an extraordinary process of destruction of historical sites and of people and of the capacity of a country to be whole. That's what's happening because of ISIL's presence and because of Assad. So both problems have to be solved. And it may well be you have to solve them simultaneously.
What's in it for President Putin? I mean, he certainly has muscled his way, and he's now got the security agreement with Iraq, Iran, Syria, and intelligence sharing. But I mean, what's in it for him? What's his interest in this?
Let me just point out very quickly that Russia has been coordinating with Iraq and in the region for many years. This is not new. And the intelligence that they will be sharing and getting from the Iraqis, we know, is nothing that interferes with us or threatens us in any way whatsoever. And if you're going to coordinate in an effort against ISIL, you're going to need some kind of coordination with respect to who's operating where and what they're going after. So President Obama and President Putin agreed to immediately engage in military-to-military deconfliction at the most basic level. Not yet to cooperate in the missions, but to deconflict.
But today's Russian airstrikes, a clear violation of Russia's supposed commitment to deconflict. But at the United Nations today, Secretary Kerry still pushing for deconfliction.
We are prepared to welcome those efforts and to find a way to deconflict our operations and thereby multiply the military pressure on ISIL and affiliated groups. But we must not and will not be confused in our fight against ISIL with support for Assad. Moreover, we have also made clear that we would have grave concerns should Russia strike areas where ISIL and al-Qaeda affiliated targets are not operating.
But Fox News learning the target was not ISIS, leading some people to believe the target may actually be Syrian rebels and part of a plan to prop up Syrian dictator Bashar Assad.
We will continue our missions exactly as we are doing them today. The French have now joined in the fight with us in our flying missions. Australians are coming in. There's a lot happening. And I am convinced over the course of the next days that there will be additional pressure on ISIL. The problem is and remains, as we keep telling Iran and Russia, if you do not find a way to be inclusive with respect to the Sunnis, 65 million of them, from Baghdad all the way up to the Turkish border, through Iraq and Syria, if they are not brought into this fight, if they are not brought into the governing, you cannot solve the problem of ISIL, and you certainly can't solve the problem of Assad in Syria.
Okay, so what's in this for President Putin? What are his designs? I mean, he seems to be very busy.
Putin has a very legitimate concern about 2,000 Chechens who are in Syria learning how to fight and be terrorists and very threatened by surrounding countries from which there are even more people who are there to learn the fight. I think he also is fearful that his client, Assad, was losing ground to both ISIL and the opposition, and therefore he wanted to shore him up. But I think shore him up with a view to trying to maintain Russia's influence and presence in the country, even as they try to secure a political solution. It's a complicated, very complicated series of different interests and relationships, all of which have to be managed in a way that try to secure a resolution, and I think we will find out. But this is not going to happen in one day or 1 week. It'll take a little while to sort through the modalities and put the political track together, and that's what we're going to do.
Now, there's more of my interview with Secretary of State John Kerry coming up. I ask where is open even a crack for a run for president 2016, and whether or not this secretary uses a private email account. Putin gave virtually a surprise bombing. It is Putin's targets that has the Pentagon and the White House very worried tonight. Fox News Chief Intelligence Correspondent Catherine Herridge joins us. Catherine.
Well, Greta, this unfolded very quickly this morning. A three-star Russian general walked into the U.S. Embassy in Baghdad. He had a brief verbal statement, and the encounter was described as curt, tense, and direct. And the message was simply for the United States to get its aircraft out of northern Syria, because the bombing by the Russians would begin in just an hour's time. Here's the key thing. With the Russians, you have to watch what they do and not what they say. They hit 6 strikes, 3 separate provinces, all of them in areas where we have seen the opposition make very modest gains in the last year. So this was about degrading those gains, not about degrading ISIS.
What is anyone from the Pentagon say anything? I obviously heard the public statement by the Secretary of Defense, but are they admitting that this? I mean, it's incredible planning. It didn't just start this morning.
I'm glad you mentioned that. There seems to be a real disconnect between what's being said politically and what was understood at a military and also an intelligence level. 2 weeks ago, the head of the Defense Intelligence Agency acknowledged publicly that they were watching Russian military hardware move into Syria. We also know within the last week that it was known to the intelligence community that the Russians were moving fighter jets also into Syria. So at an intelligence level and a military level, they saw this buildup. But the hardest thing to discern in intelligence is understanding the intent. And it would seem, at least at a political level, that the U.S. miscalculated and believed that when Putin made an agreement with the president to work out how they would operate in this airspace, it really was not a promise that was going to be kept.
Miscalculated is such a nice word for being had. Anyway, Catherine.